Good morning. My name is Sue. I am Vice President of Healthy Culture at Rogers Behavioral Health. My background is education. The first third of my career, I was teaching middle and high school kids, young adults. Loved them and loved it. And the next third of my career was focused a lot on community health education. And in that process, I learned the importance of people's story. I call it across-the-fence learning. I guarantee you that before you go to a doctor because you've got a swollen foot, you talk to someone in your family or a friend who also had a swollen foot, and you get the real scoop, and then you go to the doctor and see what the doctor has to say about it, and then you come home and you ask your friend, did you try this? Did it work? And so we've learned that creating spaces for people to talk about health, all aspects of health, is a pretty important thing for us to make it comfortable. In that process, actually had a philanthropist come forward in the Milwaukee area and say, really like this approach, have you considered mental health? And so since about 1998, that's been the focus of my work, and ended up at Rogers when Rogers decided that stigma reduction was really important. And yet, as a medical model facility, they really didn't know how to begin to add to the field of stigma reduction. And so we came under their umbrella to be able to work with our partners like Mental Health America, Wisconsin, who we've partnered with from day one, to learn more and more and then be able to share that in ways that are meaningful to different sectors in our community. So when I was asked to be here today and think about mental health and leaders, and I thought, do I talk specifically about that manager conversation when you think there's a mental health issue? Or do I step back to a broader scope? And so I've chosen to step back to a broader scope, but my deal is I want to go broad but give you really good resources and activities you can do from a broad scope. And I'll incorporate some of the specifics of these conversations as well. And I'm going to be followed up by a colleague of mine, Dr. Brad Smith, who's going to get more into mental health diagnoses. How do you know there's a problem? What do you do about it? So just for a moment, you can go to the next slide. We all know the research is just so very clear that when you and I pause, whether we're heading into a meeting, whether we're about to have a difficult conversation, whether we're thinking about what do we want to say to our significant other, that pause, that mindful moment where we kind of just take a break and let our brain get present is really important. So I've started to just try to start my presentations with a moment for you. You just heard Martina say a whole lot. And so I just ask for you for just a moment to kind of take your brain away from me and go internal and experience your breath. Maybe feel your feet on the ground. Feel yourself being present in this moment. You can go to the next slide. For me in this moment, I just want to acknowledge that everything I'm going to say was not created by me. That there are eons of wise human beings and cultures that have come to this moment to allow us to be learning together about how to be the humans we want to be in the world. And so part of my mindfulness moment is to be grounded in who I am and also connect to all the wonderful wisdom that has brought us here, which means all the wisdom that's here in this room too. So let's make this a discussion as much as possible to bring your wisdom. If this isn't relevant to your work, then it's a waste of your time. So I'm going to rely on you to help us a little bit with that relevance. You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk to you about building a compassionate workplace culture. And I'm going to talk a lot about Rogers, not because Rogers has arrived, believe me. But I'm going to talk to you about Rogers because I can share real experiences of what it's like to do this work in a workplace environment. At Rogers, we have 3 driving values: compassion, excellence, and accountability. I'm going to talk about building a compassionate workplace, but you are going to hear me say a lot about accountability. Because my belief is that as leaders, one of the best things that we can do is to help everyone in the organization understand that they have a role in a healthy workplace. That it's not just about me being a good leader and me being compassionate and me knowing how to handle employee disputes. It's really about everyone in the organization understanding that they are accountable for the culture of the workplace. So I don't have to be the only one who knows how to point out to somebody that it seems like they're having a really stressful day and their behavior with patients is a little inappropriate. Wouldn't it be awesome if if we had collegial relationships that would say, hey, let me step in, I gotcha. And they wouldn't feel all offended and disrespected, but they would feel supported and allowed to have a bad moment, but know that the excellence of our care is what's most important, and they would work together as a team. So I'm going to talk about a culture of accountability and compassion, and to me, they really need to go hand in hand. So just for a minute for you, let's again make it relevant for your work environment. What would, if let's just assume you all have a compassionate workplace to start with, but what would an even more compassionate workplace, what would be different about your current culture if it was even more compassionate? And just a couple examples of what comes to mind for you from your world. We'd have less. What would be going on? Yeah. So good job with the obvious problems. Maybe we could be a little proactive and reach out to people if we thought maybe something was going. And what if people felt comfortable to bring it up earlier so you didn't even have to be a sleuth, right, to figure it all out? If we could just surface things and deal with them. We all know that issues dealt with early are a lot easier to deal with. What else? When you think, boy, if my workplace was even more compassionate, more of, less of. Yeah. Assume positive intent. That you're going to see, I'm going to talk about behavioral agreements. That is on every organization, every team I've ever worked with. That's one of them. We would assume positive intent. And then work it through. You know, just because my intention is positive doesn't mean I'm off the hook, but it's really helpful if someone assumes that my intention was positive. Yeah. Yeah, so you get the idea. If my culture was more compassionate. What I also, next slide, I want to share with you is that there's really good research that focusing on these kinds of things has good outcomes for organizations. First of all, we know that when we're supporting resilience, that we're supporting success. That organizations where employees report that they are supported to be resilient in the workplace, that they have greater success in whatever the metrics that you're measuring success by. Retention, employees stay. It's an issue at Rogers. I don't know about you, but turnover is an issue. And why do people stay at Rogers? When we did a number of surveys around why people stay, Martina's exactly right. It wasn't pay. It was relationship with team and relationship with supervisor and number one, connection to mission. Do I get along with my team? Is my supervisor helpful to me? Do I feel supported? And do I connect with the mission of the work? It's why people stay. Pay is there, but it's pretty low on the list of why people stay. Creating a foundation of collegial supports, I've already said how important I think that is, because it's not something all leaders own only. The economic impact, if we just look at turnover, we can stop there. But then, of course, the economic impact of greater success overall. And then I love the research on innovation. If you pride yourself on being a company that is innovative, try to innovate when you're burnt out. We're asking, we work a lot in the education field, we're asking school educators all the time to do it differently, teach math differently, approach kids differently, think about this differently, try a new reading program, get innovated. innovative. And yet, over and over, we're hearing of the burnout levels in educators. 50% of teachers leave the field in the first 5 years. It's hard to innovate when you're crispy, right? So think about if innovation is a goal of yours, that would be one of the arguments for focusing on building a compassionate, accountable workplace. You go to the next slide. I'm using the notion of compassion resilience. I just want to give you a grounding definition. And the first one is probably the one you would expect me to talk about. If I'm compassion resilient, then it means that I'm able to return to a compassionate place. If I'm compassionate, I have empathy, I have some hope, I have some strength. That's a good place to be. And we face challenges, so we want to be able to bounce back. That's the resilience part of it. I'm able to be the person I want to be in the workplace and in the world, and when things go south, I'm able to bounce back. But my favorite definition is the very simple one in that second bullet, that in order for me to function in a challenging world, and obviously we're in a challenging time in our country right now, I need to find an ability to be optimistic in the midst of imperfection. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more, how critical this optimism and imperfection is. It's not that I don't see imperfections. I see it in myself all the time. I see it in my colleagues all the time. I see it in my boss. I see it in the system within that I work. I see it in all the systems that are around us. There is so much imperfection. But in order for me to be able to show up and be compassionate to you, be excellent at my work, hold others accountable and myself accountable, I need to be able to figure out how to get in touch with a little optimism. You can go on to the next slide. I'm sharing with you concepts that are a part of what we call the Compassion Resilience Toolkits. They've been developed over time in partnership with many people across our state here, our Department of Public Instruction, our Department of Human Services, many educators, family members, our partner organizations and an organization called WISE, Wisconsin Initiative for Stigma Elimination, came together to create these resources. They're free and accessible at compassionresilienceToolkit.org. But the focus of the work is that we, first of all, have common language for what does it actually mean to act with compassion. And I'm going to share that with you. For the person who asked the question about what do I do as a manager, I'm going to give you a framework for that conversation. And then the modules that Martina talked about are going to take you much deeper into applying those. I need to be able to understand what fatigue looks like so that I can identify it early on. Like any other problem, we want to identify it early on, so let's be sure we understand what this means. It's not as simple as burnout. That's one word, and that's really the end stage of compassion fatigue. So important that we even know what that is so we can talk about it with each other and identify it. You're going to hear that we think it's really, really critical that we understand where we have control. And so we spend some time on, and I'm going to share an activity around the locus of control. We want to maximize, of course, what leads to resilience. We think that expectations are really critical. Clear, realistic, and aspirational expectations are critical to the work environment and our ability to have conversations around that. When we look at what burns people out, it's lack of clarity quite often. And so there's some exercises around how do we get greater clarity? How do we set and support boundaries so that we can function with resilience in our work? This notion of creating a sense of accountability. And then, yes, we are about self-care. And I'll talk a little bit about self-care, but honestly, in the short amount of time that I have, I'm guessing that you could tell me 10 really great self-care practices because we're pretty good at telling everybody what's good to do as individuals. You ought to walk, you ought to eat right, you ought to do mindfulness practices, you ought to practice a little self-compassion. I can go through that, and I'm guessing a lot of you can go through what's good for self-care. We actually think it's unethical in the workplace to give somebody a Fitbit and tell them to count their steps if we don't have clear expectations, if we aren't supporting them to understand their accountability for the culture, if we're not supporting them to set boundaries so that they can balance their work-life situations. So that's why I'm choosing to step back a little bit and not delve deeply into self-care. I can give you lots of resources on self-care if you don't have them already. So this is the work that we've been doing. There's 900 facilitators trained across the state of Wisconsin, and probably about 350 that we've started training now nationally. We're working with the state of Kentucky on this work. Rogers sites are around the country. So we've had a lot of time in the last 3 years to really delve deeply into implementing some of this work in organizations. You can go to the next slide. I mentioned CompassionResilienceToolkit.org. It's free and accessible resources. And our role is to support you in adapting them to work best in your work environment. So our consultation is free. But let's head on to the next slide. So I said it was important for us to have some common language around what we mean by compassion. And this is kind of the framework for a conversation when there's a challenge. So our first step in compassionate action is to be able to notice when there's pain. Now that sounds simple, but if someone is cussing at me in my office, depending on the day and the moment, I may not notice pain behind the anger, right? And so I may not be ready to have a compassionate conversation with this individual if I can't notice pain behind behavior. So that first step of is asking myself, can I even notice pain? I know when we work with educators, we ask them, when's the time you're least likely to notice pain? And it's probably true for all of us. The first 15 minutes of the day and the last 15 minutes of the day. Because my eyes are out the door or my eyes are I got to check my email. I really don't want to have to deal with issues around me. And so structurally, what does that mean for schools? Where should teachers be in the morning when kids are coming in? They should be in the hallways noticing pain. But if their mindset is, I just need to get in there and get my classroom organized, we need to at least recognize that this first step of, am I in the place to notice pain, is pretty important. Second step. Once I notice pain around me, it's an employee, and I notice that things haven't been performing in ways that they typically do. I'm going to notice that. Next, I'm going to go in and I'm going to do a self-check. I'm going to turn inward instead of outward, and I'm going to ask myself, what are some biases that might be at play here? That employee again, right? Or I've seen this before. I know exactly how to deal with it. Right? Those are natural ways of thinking. I am not someone who says don't make judgments because I know that our brains are wired to judge. It's okay. What we really want people to do is be aware of your judgment, aware enough to be able to set it aside, to get curious, and that's the next step. Once I've said, okay, I've got some biases going here, I think I know how to fix this person, that's a bias, right? I'm going to set that aside, notice that I'm thinking that way, and then I'm going to move on to the next step, if you'll click. And that is to seek understanding. I'm going to start to have a conversation with this person. If I'm initiating it, I'm going to make some concrete observations. I have noticed that you've come to work late 3 times in the last week, and that's not a typical pattern for you. A concrete, objective observation. And then I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to let them talk. And this is another key. People will say, well, what if people don't talk? Then I'm going to just observe. You're not saying anything. I'm guessing you're wondering if I'm safe. Right? That's natural, right? It might be smart for people not to talk to me. Right? So I'm just going to point that out. Maybe you're wondering if I'm a safe person to talk to. Maybe you're wondering if you want to say anything to anybody. Or maybe you're thinking there's someone else you'd rather talk to than me. So I'm validating their silence instead of saying, what's wrong? Or what's wrong with me? Just letting them know. Also, by that validation of their silence, I'm creating a safer space for them. But when I start to listen, this is the trap that all of us fall into. You want to remember that you're not listening for details. Because the goal here isn't for you to know enough to solve the problem. The goal here is for you to pull out the wisdom of that human so they can solve their own problem. Because most of us know we should show up on time for work. Most of us know that 3rd drink the night before was probably not a good idea. we're pretty good at solving our own issues of what gets us to the place that we're in, and we rarely need someone else to say, you ought to see a therapist. Most of us, if we're struggling with finding joy in life, have already figured out that maybe there's something there for me, right? So what is it I want to listen for? I want to listen for strength, because right now this person isn't connected to their strengths, are they? They're connected to their pain. So as I'm listening, I want to listen for their strengths and their feelings. Those are two things on top of my mind as a listener. And let me show you why I need those two things. The next step, if you click, is I want to cultivate empathy. And so empathy for me is that whatever you're talking about, whatever the details are, that whatever feeling you express, I can connect to having had that feeling before. Instead of, why would you be embarrassed about that? Because I've listened to the details and I wouldn't feel that way around those details. I'm connecting to, oh, they're feeling embarrassed. I remember a time when I felt embarrassed. It's really not a good place to be. That keeps me in the game of listening and not fixing. So I listen for feelings simply so I can go internal enough to connect with this human being. Not that I can agree with why they feel that way. You're really angry about that? Are you kidding me? Anger. I can remember feeling anger. And I know what that feels like, right? So I'm listening for feeling. And then secondly, I'm listening for strength, because if you go to the next step, after I've cultivated empathy, I want to help this person discern what's best for them. They are going to discern what's best for them. And the best way for me to do that is to point to a strength that I've heard. Because if my mind is all into how bad I am or how bad the situation is, my brain is focused on the negative, I want to help them to turn their brain around a little bit to some positives. So I'm going to say, wow, it took a lot of strength for you just to lay that all out here. When you were talking, you mentioned you've experienced this before. What did you learn that last time? Sounds like maybe there's people you'd like to turn to for advice here. I'm listening and I'm just feeding back to them anything that feels like a potential strength, because it will open their brain up to be able to be a problem solver versus focusing on the problem. And in the process, can I ever give advice? Yes. We all know we should avoid giving advice, but actually the reality is we can give advice, but this is the rule about advice. Wait until you are sure they're stuck. And how do you know they're stuck? You ask them, are you stuck? Yeah, I can't even think of anything. And then you ask permission. I have some thoughts. Would you like to hear them? That's another brain opener. Let me tell you what to do closes the brain down. Think about times people have told you they know what you should do with your life, right? By simply saying, I have some thoughts, would you like to hear them? It opens their brain up to listen to you a little bit more. And then you can offer at this point too, I'd like to be supportive. What do you think I could do that would be supportive of you? Right? So they're in control, they're making decisions, they're accountable for their life. You're not accountable for the solutions to their problems. I have some resources I'd be willing to offer even. There's lots of things you can do, but they're really the ones that are solving the problem. Move on to the next slide. And then the last step here, of course, is they take action, and in the work environment, it's perfectly fine to say, well, it sounds like you'd like to commit to X. I'd like to be able to check in with you in a couple weeks to see if you were able to move forward on that. So it's okay to hold people accountable. You might even ask permission. Would it be helpful if we met in a week to hear about how that went for you? Just, sometimes having an accountability buddy helps in taking the next steps on some difficult things. So compassionate action steps. We need to know these as leaders and practice them. But everyone in the organization needs to do this, because do you need to have all the compassionate conversations in the organization? No. But as a supervisor, having common language across the organization allows you to say things like, did you do a self-check? When someone comes and complains about a situation between employees, this is a great arbiter when there are issues between employees, because you can begin to hold people accountable to things like listening. Could you get in a place of empathy to try to understand what that person might have been feeling when you said that to them? Those are all good words to be able to have as common language. So that sets the foundation. We can move on to the next slide. I've said this already, really critical, this self-check piece, and be sure if ever we talk about self-check that we're clear that we're not. I try to avoid saying to people, don't make judgments. I really have tried to change my language to take a moment to be aware of your judgments. Ask yourself if they're going to serve you right now. Can you set them aside? Set them aside long enough to get to know the uniqueness of this situation. Okay, we can move forward. Self-compassion. When we started doing this work on compassion resilience, we put self-compassion back in the self-care section towards the end of the toolkit, and we realized that just like so many other things in life, it's hard for me to love you if I don't love myself. It's really hard for me to be a compassionate human being if I can't be compassionate to myself. So this is just a quick check. Think of the last time you really screwed up. Last time you really screwed up, I'll tell you, I really screwed up yesterday, and I was up at 2 this morning thinking about my screw up. So I don't have self-compassion down, let me tell you. So think about the last time you really screwed up. Were you as kind to yourself as you would be to a friend around this screw up? Did you think you can't believe that you made this ridiculous mistake? Or did you say, I made a mistake like everyone makes mistakes in this world? Could you connect with common humanity to help you get through? And then thirdly, can you be mindful of how you're feeling in the moment, but not overly attached to the feelings of the moment? Overly attached is waking up at 2 a.m. thinking about the screw up you made, right? In the moment of the screw up saying, this really feels embarrassing. I don't like feeling this way. Actually, I think I'm going to take a walk and talk to my partner about this to help it just leave my mind. That's being mindful of the emotion around it. If we can't act with some level of self-compassion, if I'm not treating myself this way, then I'm treating myself negatively. And often when I treat myself negatively, I project that negativity outwards. So you know what it's like. You've been around people who seem angry with the world, and you wonder if they're really angry at themselves. That's the role of self-compassion, helps us to deal with that. Okay, we'll move forward to the next slide. So this is the breaking compassion fatigue or burnout down into stages. And I think you're going to find it really helpful. In every organization or team we've worked with, they've liked this so much, this has become the visual that people print off and hang up in their workspaces. So the first stage of compassion fatigue is the Zealot stage. That is when we're new to the job, new to a project. We love it. We're going to change the work environment. We're, like that mama cat, we're going to go the extra mile. We're going to give 150%, which is ridiculous because all we can ever give is 100%, right? But we are there ready to go. First stage of fatigue, because almost everything we do in life is more like a marathon than a sprint. And so our job as leaders is to get close to these zealots and help them get real about what it's going to take to do the work and to stay in the role. If no one helps them to do that, this zealot person keeps going on to the next stage, if you'll click, which is the irritability stage. That's when you notice all the imperfections around you. You're doing the project, you're in a new role, and you start to realize your supervisor has no clue what this project is about, and the people you've been asked to work with don't have everything that we need to get the job done, and oh, by the way, you're not sure that you know what's up. And the systems aren't set up to support you. And who's paying me for this work? This is asking me to do top-level work, and I'm getting mid-level pay, right? That's when you start to look around at everything that's wrong, and you get cynical, sometimes hopeless, helpless. And then, let's move on to the next one. Withdrawal, a natural human reaction to when things get complex. In this last year, there's been a lot of withdrawal. Because we're in a really complex time. And we thought it was going to be great when we started coming back to work. And I don't know about your work environments, but what we're finding at Rogers is we've got to slow down on this coming back. Because we just said, yeah, come on back. And we got people who've never seen each other in person, who suddenly have desks next to each other and haven't negotiated, how loud you can talk on the phone. It's just an interesting situation we're in. Coming back isn't the panacea we thought it would be. We as leaders have to think about the complexity. Oh, wait a minute. I have to get up earlier to drive farther. I can't check in on my kids as much as I was able to because no one knew that I was, texting with my kids when there's some shifts that people are making in this environment that we thought we would all be celebrating and dancing in the streets, and we actually may be experiencing more burnout in this transition back than we ever anticipated because of the complexity. So natural human reaction to overwhelm is to back up. And obviously in the workforce, it can be presenteeism, I'm here but not bringing my whole self, or absenteeism. And then if you move on to the next stage of the cycle is the zombie stage. That's where I'm coming to work, I've got my walls up, I've disconnected from the people around me, and I'm just here doing my work, doing what I know is best and heading home. I've lost the ability to connect and learn with and collaborate. I've turned into more of a zombie. We often think of burnout as zombie. What I want you to do is think of burnout all along the way, because our prevention can be up here on that Zealot and irritability stage. Much more important that we're intervening there than figuring out what to do with the crispy people. So when we do this work on compassion and resilience, we say this is not for the people that are burnt out. This is for everybody to be a prevention program and a culture building program. Can move forward. And we can go on to the next slide. It's fine. One of the important things in this work is to remember that this fatigue is a normal response to complexity and overwhelm. Doesn't mean we're bad people. I've been around that compassion fatigue cycle probably 3 times in my career. It's a normal response to tough situations, but we can do things to intervene. Can move forward. And I also would love a clock. Or do you? 5 to 9? Thank you. So now I want to get into team conversation, and this is where I'm going to give you some specific activities that you can do with your teams. You can do the other teaching that I just did. They're all visuals, free and accessible, that you can use if you want to have those conversations. But these are some team conversations that are in the middle of the toolkit that really are about building accountability and culture in your organization. The first one is, how do we identify what drives fatigue in our work environment and what drives resilience? And then, how do we get this notion of control? We found that focusing on the locus of control is critical to people's resilience. And what I mean by that is you can have 3 people in the same position doing the same work, and they can tell you what's driving their fatigue. And one will say, yeah, no, I got that. I know who to talk to about that, and we can work on changing it. And another will say, this really is awful, and I can't believe the leadership hasn't changed it. That's the difference of locus of control. Do I look at outside of me for making change, or do I see where I have some power and efficacy in making change around my work environment? So the activity, go to the next slide, and go to the next one here. I'm going to share what an outcome of one of the activities is. We get people in a room, and I've done this with, probably the largest group I've done it with is 50, as well as small groups, small teams. And we put paper up on the wall. If you use Miro or some great technology, you can use all different ways to do brainstorming. But we get them listing what is driving their fatigue. Just a long list. We ask them, to fill the wall up with what are the drivers of fatigue. We give everyone a marker so they're not watching each person write. They're just filling a board with drivers of fatigue. That can feel like a complaint session, and it can make you a little nervous, but it's okay. Hang in there. And they're not color-coded yet. They're just putting them all up on the wall. And then we ask them, okay, now I'd like you to go over here, and what's driving your resilience? When you come to work, what makes you feel alive and resilient? Get all that list up on the wall. And then we go back and we start asking questions of the list. And so this is color-coded because it's digital. I prefer in a room with real people and markers and walls. So I would say, talk together about each one of these that you've listed and tell me where you have a sense of control. So in this case, the greens are the people that did this activity had a sense of control. The reds are, they crossed it out. I don't feel like I have any control. And the blues are where there was disagreement. And this isn't a consensus activity. This is you and I are in the same role, and we're at the wall, and we're talking about focusing on the problem. Our organization focuses on the problem too much. That's what's driving my fatigue. And I'm asked now with my colleague to decide, do we have any control over that? And I say, no, it's the leaders. They've got this weird system that has us focusing on problems all the time. And my colleague next to me says, no, actually, I feel like I really try to help us not always focus on the problem. So already they're beginning to learn from each other that, gosh, you could have a different perspective on these things that are driving your fatigue. And maybe I could take the perspective of my colleague. So the goal here is not consensus, it's just to have them have conversations about where do they have control. Those L's, guess what those are? Leaders. So then we go back and we say, what do you look to leadership to have an impact on? And so the person who looked to leadership to deal with that whole problem focus idea is able to say, I think leadership has a role in this. But do you see how many L's are there that are also next to areas that are green? We're in this together. Actually, this competing home versus job responsibilities, I have a role in that. I have some control over that. And my leaders have some control over that too. So we're starting to slowly build this sense of individual accountability. So what does that have to do with someone in your workplace who's experiencing a mental health challenge? What would any of this have to do with why we're here today? What do we do about people that are facing mental health challenges in the workplace? Yeah. Absolutely. We're hearing them. So I don't have to stand up as this person with anxiety who's, feeling like we have too many meetings and I'm so overwhelmed and anxious and I don't know who to tell. I've created a safe environment for all employees to talk about what's driving their fatigue. So my voice is just a part of theirs. And I'm seeing that other colleagues have some of these thoughts. Because if you know anything about anxiety, it's really easy to think that you're the only one that feels this particular way. And so it begins to normalize maybe some of those so I don't over-catastrophize about some things. And it's giving colleagues a chance to have some voice together, and leaders are getting some insight. And you know what we ask leaders to do with this list? Is to take the ones with all the L's and sit down as a leadership team and ask themselves, in the next year or two, where do we think we have control and plan some action, and where don't we? And then we ask them to be transparent back with their team. You know what, the 12 L's you gave us? Here's 6 that we think we can make a difference in the next year on. And we're actually going to focus on it, and we need your help on some of these. Because even though we have some power here, your voice is going to help us to figure out how to do this. And the other 6, let's put that on we can't control for now. And the reason that's important is we've found that in some work environments, people spend an inordinate amount of time on the things they can't control individually, and their leaders can't control either. But they spend a lot of time when they come together as a team talking about all these things that are driving their fatigue that no one can control. And so the last question we ask teams when we do this activity is, when you come together, what % of time do you want to spend talking about all those red items? And the answer isn't 0, because sometimes we need validation that things are hard. But usually people come up, typical number is 15% of the time. This is a strategy to avoid negativity in the workplace. Because we say, all right, if you want to spend 15% of the time talking about the things you can't control, what if you're in a meeting and 25% of the time has already gone towards talking about these things that you can't control? At Rogers, it might be the significant rise in severity of patients. It's hard stuff. It's a reality. And how much time do we want to spend complaining about people are sicker? We can't control that, right? So in a meeting where people are complaining about the severity of patients, I might do this. And that's my signal with my team. I think we've gone outside our 15 minutes and we're circling the drain here, guys. Let's spend a greater proportion of our time working on solving the things we actually feel like we have control that we can solve. So if negativity is an issue on your team, and let me tell you, if you are someone living with depression and anxiety and are a team that's swirling in negativity, it's not a place where you want to work. And you can think, because depression, at least my experience of depression, is a negatively self-centered experience. So if something's wrong, it must be me that made it wrong. And when I begin to see my team working towards a more positive environment, it's going to be an environment that helps raise me out of that negativity as well, and I see that process is shared. All right, so that's one activity that you can do. It's written up in the toolkit with directions of how to do it. Let's move on. And three other areas when it comes to building teams. I mentioned the expectations area, and there are activities in the toolkit. I'm not going to focus on those today, but we know that all of us function best when we understand the why, the what, and the how of an expectation. And so there's some work that you can do together with your teams to work with the people who set the expectations, but even more importantly, to work with the people who get the expectations set for them, to build up their ability to say, wait a minute, I get the why, but no one has really helped me with the how here, right? You're coming back to me and telling me that I'm doing the how wrong, but you spent all your time telling me why we're doing this change, but no one really helped me with the how. That's that shared accountability for meeting expectations. So the why, the what, and the how is a part of the expectation work we do. You can move on to the next slide. We're going to take a look at boundaries. This is a quote from Brené Brown that is one of my favorite quotes, at least for a guide in my life. Compassionate people ask for what they need. They say no when they need to. When they say yes, they mean it. And they're compassionate because their boundaries keep them out of resentment. As a supervisor of a team, I can't tell you how many times someone has brought resentment into my space, and I've asked them, was there a boundary you could have set that could have kept you out of resentment here? Yeah. Is there a conversation that you could have had 3 months ago? But first I have to ask that of myself, right? I experience, as a supervisor, I have resentment towards some people on my team for not doing what it is I thought they should do. So I have to ask myself, did I set a boundary here? Why am I feeling resentment? It's just an interesting concept to work with. So let's move forward and take a look at what this looks like. This is where, and these next two activities are going to come together, and this is really where we get very concrete about culture. So we bring people in a room, and we start by having them brainstorm, what are behaviors that you think would be helpful for every adult in our workplace to do? So this is their chance to look outside of themselves. I wish people would clean up in the kitchen after they use the kitchen. I wish people would respond to email in 2 days instead of 2 weeks. And, people are pretty able to talk about, this is what I think everyone ought to be doing. And then we come back to say, all right, if that's what you want out of everyone else, that's also what you would like out of yourself. So let's call these your yeses. This is the person you would like to be when you show up in the workspace. Our boundaries are simply no's to support our yeses. And so then we ask people, and this is the most difficult question of the work we do, share with me a no that would support your yes. And so these are just some examples up here of what people have done in groups that we've worked with. I'm going to say no to working nonstop throughout the workday, because my yes of showing up with energy and focus, I can't do that if I work nonstop. One of the things we've done in our virtual world of meeting after meeting, how many of you are still in that meeting after meeting world virtually? We started to say, even though the meeting says 9 o'clock, if it's our team, it's 9:05, because it's very difficult to schedule in breaks, and so we've just made that a practice. I'm going to say no to extra duties, because I'm overwhelmed right now. I'm going to have conversations. I'm going to say no to conversations that you don't have time for in the moment, instead of doing them halfway and then not feeling good about the conversation. So I'm going to practice saying, I'd love to talk with you right now about that, but it feels like something that needs 100% of me, and I can't give you that right now. Could we schedule a time to talk? Those are boundaries. Those are no's, but you see when you put it in a yes, I care enough about you to say no. I care enough about our environment to say no. Interesting conversations to have with teams and organizations about what that looks like. We can move on to the next slide. These are tips for setting compassionate boundaries. Know your yeses. Be proactive. Just say it. Be direct. And then when there's a problem in the moment, just, remember I said that first part of the day is not the best time to reach me? That's just reminding them of the boundary. Not a big deal, but it takes people a while to adjust. And what we found is people really love to support other people's boundaries. Like, just tell me what you need. I'd gladly do it for you. Oh, I forgot. That's right. People are pretty good at that adjustment. And then obviously back up your boundary with action. Move on. So then for staff culture, to take this into how to really support the culture in your work environment, is we take those lists of healthy adult behaviors, and if we do it with multiple teams, like at Rogers, we did it with probably 8 different teams before we developed Rogers-wide behavior agreements. And we can go to the next slide and I'll show you what those look like. These are our behavior agreements for the culture at Rogers. These are aspirational. No one at Rogers does these 100% of the time. But this gives us a guide. When I hire somebody now, I share the behavior agreements. This is the culture we're trying to build in our organization. We want to be approachable through our presence, our tone, our words, and our body language. We want to speak up when we see problems, and we want to come with a solution-focused attitude. So I hope that when you come to Rogers, you'll notice problems. I also hope that you'll bring all your solution-focused thinking to the table, because we need that from you. We want to seek to understand and value diverse perspectives. We want to work together as a team to accomplish goals. And so you can start to see, this is accountability, right? As a leader, I can ask somebody, did you take time to understand their perspective on this? What did you learn when you paused to try to understand their values in this particular situation? We want to seek support when it's needed. I did this work with the 20 senior executive of Rogers before we started doing it across the organization, and this was an important one to them. I felt like, here we all are as senior leaders in this organization, and we're not so sure that we're asking each other for support when we need it, and who else is going to give you that? We don't need a lot of lone rangers. We need to know that you're taking care of yourself and that you'll reach out to each other if you need support. And so they made an agreement among the 20 senior leaders at Rogers that they would actually seek support from each other. We want to monitor and support work-life balance and individual well-being. That's a scary one. I have to tell you, one of our leaders said to me, I'm worried about that one because, sometimes we need people to work double shifts. And what if they start saying, wait a minute, that doesn't support my work-life balance? It's a conversation we need to have, right? How unethical of an organization to say we're not going to work with you to figure that out. Transparent, direct communication. It sounds like you're talking to me about that person. Our agreement was that we would try direct conversation. Would you like me to coach you on what it would look like to have a direct conversation with that person? Practice effective use of email. Every team needs to then decide what that means. Is it 48 hours? Is it 2 business days? Is it 2 weeks? Whatever it is, wouldn't it be nice if you had an agreement on that? So that, not that I can nail you if you didn't get back to me in 2 days, but I can say, I know our agreement is 2 days, are you okay? I can come at this from a compassionate place because I know we're all working towards this. And then hold ourselves and others accountable to the agreements and other commitments with respect. So this culture that we're trying to build, kind of the driving force behind this work was, what do we do about people who don't feel welcome and supported and engaged at Rogers or in any work environment? What do we do about that to support them? And actually, all of this work came out of our stigma work, because you know what we found from people that experience mental health challenges, where they say they experience the most stigma? Churches, schools, healthcare, the very places in our community whose goal it is to be supportive of people with mental health challenges, and yet somehow they were acting in ways that came off as stigmatizing to people with mental health challenges. And as we started to dig deeper on that, we realized that when you and I can't act from a place of compassion, because we're burnt out, because we're overwhelmed, because we're just maybe unaware of how to manage a situation, that we can come across as the person we really don't want to be. And so rather than say, knock it off, be a better person, we decided maybe we ought to help people to understand what gets you to that place, and then help you hold yourself and others accountable for an environment where we support each other to be compassionate with each other. So my choice in doing this today with you was, when it comes to mental health challenges of your employees, build this culture. It's going to make those conversations so much easier than if you've never had these kinds of expectations and suddenly you sit down with someone and say, I want to have a direct conversation with you about how you're feeling. And I want to hold you accountable for some of the behaviors that you've had lately. That conversation is going to go much better in the context of a compassionate culture in your organization. So, thank you. Open to questions, and Martina and I said we would take questions together because Martina was involved in developing this work along with me. So, yes.
Developing this culture, sounds like.
Yeah, right. So what do you do? How do you motivate people as you're trying to build this culture? How do you motivate people to stay? And honestly, I would even say, even if you have this culture, there are going to be some people who come in and say, direct conversations are not my way of doing things. You ought to just know your job and do it, right? So there's some people who won't fit into this culture that I'm describing. And so I think, let's just be honest, there's some people that you don't want in your work environment, if this is the environment that you want. There's other people who've never tasted this before, who are willing to work towards it, and I think that's part of us as leaders. This is about system change, and it doesn't happen overnight. And a lot of the work that we're doing internally at Rogers and that I'm doing with school districts across the state is helping people to understand patience, tenacity, how to help bring people along and not expect people to be there tomorrow. It really is a commitment to culture change. It takes a while. But if we go back to what keeps people in the workplace, connection to mission, connection to supervisor, connection to colleagues. And so I think for the majority of people, this is the culture that's going to keep them. There will be some who they don't want to do this work. Yeah. Other comments or questions? Yeah.
Your life cycle.
Totally agree that it's the most difficult and highly unlikely. Why we think it's so important to get this language of stages and help people to understand I'm in these early stages and what do I need, and for managers to recognize early stages and be able to intervene earlier. I'm an eternal optimist, so yes, I think we can do work with the zombies. One of the practices, I think, of zombies, if you think about, they've disengaged and they're pretty sure that they have the answers, right? Because they're not working collaboratively anymore, just to save their soul because they don't know how to, for all kinds of reasons. This isn't a shame or blame statement, but they're pretty sure, they have an overinflated sense of their own importance. Right? So how do we use that overinflated sense of their own importance to help them re-engage? Here's something that you seem to be really good at. What would it look like for you to do some teaching with a group of your colleagues around this particular, so we're trying to bring them back in from their strength versus, you are so crispy, I'm wondering if you should leave the organization. So that's where I would start, always start from strength. And I agree, it's hard work. In this world of a really difficult time finding employees, we're probably going to be doing the harder work to keep them. Oh. Any other questions or comments? The resources that I share with you are free and accessible and support to utilize them in the work environment. We're very interested in working with organizations that want to do this work internally, so you can get in touch with us. And I think if you go to the next slide, we're going to go through this. There are resources in there on self-care that I didn't touch on, but lots of resources on growth, how to build a growth mindset, how to be more organized in terms of your schedule and commitments. We have an appreciative inquiry activity on competence because we know, and especially, again, think about the employee who's dealing with a mental health challenge. It's really easy for them to lose sight of their own competence. And we know that our well-being that an important component of our well-being is to see ourselves as competent. And so there's an activity around helping people to reflect and recognize their own competences. We talk a lot about recognition. I want everyone else to recognize my good work. It's pretty clear that my ability to recognize my own strengths and competence is even more important than you telling me I do a good job. And so it's activities around that. Core values and its connection to the mission. There's really this stress resilience. There's an awesome TED Talk by Kelly McGonigal that's linked to in the toolkit, or you could just look up Kelly McGonigal. She has a wonderful research-based perspective on stress that blew my mind the first time I listened to her work. It had a lot to do with the impact of our perspective about stress versus the stressful situation itself. And it's really an interesting piece on stress. Emotional regulation planning for adults. We think all the time that kids ought to be able to label that they're angry and have a plan for what they're going to do when they're angry, and people around them ought to know how to support them when they're angry. It'd be really nice for us as adults to also have our own emotional regulation plans and to be able to articulate, this is what really sets me off in the workplace, and this is how I've behaved in the past, but it's really not how I want to behave in the future, so this is what I'm going to do to manage it, and this is what would be helpful from you as my manager. So you might want to check out these emotional regulation plans. And then relationship building. So that's kind of the self-care resources that are available in the toolkit too, and you can move forward. And that's, again, the website, and you can reach us through that, as well as WISE at wisewisconsin.org. Other comments or questions? All right, thank you.